You could hear the roar of their engines long before the bikes came into view, splitting the still air of the desert highway like thunder on a clear day. The ground vibrated softly beneath the cracked asphalt, a warning tremor of what was coming. 5 motorcycles, loud, customized beasts wrapped in chrome and menace, tore down the empty road toward a weather-worn diner perched on the edge of nowhere. The name Miller's Grill was barely hanging on to its rusting sign, sun-bleached. And forgotten, inside, the air was still, the scent of grease, coffee, and old jukebox songs lingering like ghosts. Walter Jones sat in the corner booth by the window, slowly sipping from a chipped white mug. He had chosen this place because it was quiet, unremarkable, and most importantly, far from the noise of the world he had left behind. 68 years. Old, clean-shaven, but weathered, Walter wore a faded denim jacket with a Vietnam veteran's patch sewn onto the sleeve. A battered ball cap sat low on his brow, casting a shadow over his steely eyes. To the few other patrons in the diner, he was just another old black man passing through, maybe on a road trip, maybe on his way to visit family, but if anyone had looked closer, they'd have seen the rigid posture of a man who'd spent decades standing at attention. The quiet vigilance in the way his eyes scanned the room between sips, the way his muscles barely relaxed even when seated. His hands, large, rough, and scarred, rested calmly on the table. But they looked like they belonged to someone half his age and twice as dangerous. Outside, the growl of the motorcycles stopped abruptly. Few heads turned inside the diner. The waitress, a woman in her 50s, with frizzy red hair and tired eyes, froze mid-step, her gaze flicking to the window. Walter didn't turn around. He simply placed his mug down with care and folded his newspaper with surgical precision. The diner door burst open, boots, heavy, deliberate. 5 of them walked in like they owned the place. Black leather vests, tattoos crawling up their necks like ivy, sunglasses still on despite the indoor light. They smelled of gasoline, whiskey, and arrogance. The tallest one, broad-shouldered brute, with a blonde beard and a serpent tattoo that wrapped around his neck, led the pack. His vest bore the name Kane and a crude skull logo labeled Iron. Fang's MC. Everyone in the diner shrank into silence. Kane's eyes scanned the room like a predator looking for prey. Then they landed on Walter. He jabbed a thumb toward him and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Looks like someone's sitting in our booth." His crew chuckled like hyenas echoing a kill. Walter didn't move. Kane strutted over, standing, just inches from the table. "Hey, old man, didn't you hear me? This is our spot. We ride through here every Thursday. That means you move." Walter lifted his eyes slowly, calm, steady, unreadable. "This booth wasn't reserved, Walter," said voice like gravel and ice. The room seemed to hold its breath. Kane snorted, leaning in closer. "You got a smart mouth for a guy who's outnumbered." Walter folded his hands together, one thumb slowly circling the other. "You got a loud mouth for someone who's never been hit in silence." That caught Kane off guard. He blinked, then grinned. "You trying to be funny, Grandpa?" The others flanked him now, surrounding the table. One of them, a skinny guy with patchy facial hair and a look of something more nervous than brave, laughed and slapped the back of another's vest. "Maybe he don't know who we are." The guy beside him, a bald man with brass knuckles already on one hand, cracked his neck and said, "Maybe we should teach him." Kane reached forward, snatching the cap off Walter's head. The motion was quick, like a snake strike. He held it up, squinting at the faded patch on the front. Well, what do we got here?" said mockingly. "Special forces, huh? That's supposed to scare us?" He dropped the cap onto the floor with disrespect. Walter finally moved slowly with care. Stood. Every motion was deliberate. His joints didn't creak like an old man's should. Oh, his body was precise, coiled, and sharp like a blade. Drawn halfway from its sheath, he stared Kane in the eye. Not a flicker of fear. Not a drop of hesitation. "I've been quiet all morning," Walter said, his voice low but crisp. "Was enjoying my coffee. But I don't take kindly to threats, especially from men who mistake numbers for power." The bikers chuckled again, but this time it sounded forced. Kane leaned forward, poking Walter in the chest. "You got guts. Old man, I'll give you that. But you clearly don't know what kind of people you're messing with." Walter's eyes didn't leave his. "And you don't know what kind of man you're threatening." There was a beat of silence, sharp enough to cut steel. The waitress shuffled closer, her voice shaky. Maybe y'all can take another booth. It's not worth it, really." Kane ignored her. Walter, without breaking eye contact, bent down, picked up his cap, and dusted it off gently like it was sacred. He placed it back on his head and straightened it with military precision. "5 of you," he said calmly. "1 of me. You think I haven't seen worse odds? You think you can take us?" Kane sneered. Walter didn't answer. He just looked at each man and turned slow, deliberate, measuring. In those seconds, something in the air shifted. The bikers didn't notice it, but the others in the diner did. The cook, peeking from the kitchen. The older couple in the back booth who had been quietly eating their pancakes. Even the waitress, who clutched her notepad like it was a shield, sensed the difference. Walter's breathing didn't change. His hands didn't ball into fists. He just stood there, still patient, like a lion waiting for foolish prey. To get close enough to bite, Kane finally laughed, shaking his head. "Man, you're out of your damn mind." Walter's voice was quiet. The words struck like gunfire. "No, I've just lived long enough to see your kind come and go." And with that, he took a single step forward. That one step did more than anything else. Kane shifted back slightly unconsciously. Instinctively, his crew tensed. Walter didn't raise his hands. He didn't yell. But his presence filled the room now, bigger than 5 bikers, bigger than the diner. Storm disguised in denim and silence. "Last chance," Walter said. "Walk out. Nobody gets hurt." That should have been enough. It wasn't. Kane smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes anymore. His pride was louder than his instincts. He raised his hand to swing, and then everything changed. To be continued in part. Closing parenthesis. Kane's fist came swinging fast. Wild. And confident, like a man who'd never been taught what it felt like to miss. But Walter had already moved. His body dropped low, smooth and sudden, knees bending like a coiled spring. The punch cut through empty air, before Kane even registered. The miss Walter's hand shot up, not with a strike, but a redirect. He used Kane's momentum against him, guiding the biker's arm past his own body. Then fluidly, effortlessly he twisted, dropped his center of gravity, and flipped the 230-pound man over his hip like it was muscle memory. Kane crashed to the floor with a heavy, breath-stealing thud that echoed off the walls. The diner erupted into stunned silence. Forks clattered onto plates. The jukebox in the corner, playing an old rock song nobody was really listening to, suddenly felt like it was blasting into a church. One of the bikers, the bald one with brass knuckles, reacted on instinct. Lunged. Walter spun sideways, pivoting on the balls of his feet, and caught the man's arm just as the punch came down. In a blink, he stepped inside the man's reach, turned his hips, and drove an elbow into the biker's ribs with terrifying precision. A wet crunch followed. The man howled and stumbled back, gasping for air. A third man tried to blindside Walter, swinging a thick chain that he'd somehow concealed under his vest. Walter didn't flinch. His left hand came up and caught the chain mid-swing. The biker tried to yank it back, but Walter held on grip-strong like a vicent, stepped forward, jerking the chain sharply. The biker was pulled forward like a rag doll before he could recover. Walter's boot slammed into his chest with enough force to send him flying backward into the counter, knocking over a basket of condiments and crashing into a napkin dispenser. 3. Down, the skinny one, who had been smirking earlier, froze where he stood. His hands were up, but they trembled. Fear had crept into his eyes now, displacing whatever false bravado had lived there a moment ago. He looked at Walter like a man seeing a ghost know. Worse, a ghost trained by the U.S. government to kill silently and without hesitation. You're military stemmed. Walter didn't answer. He didn't need to. His body said everything. The last biker, a redhead with a patchy beard, drew a knife. His eyes burned with some blend of panic and pride, like he couldn't back down even, though every atom in his body was screaming that he should. He lunged, fast and clumsy. Walter stepped sideways, grabbed the man's wrist, twisted, and slammed his arm against the edge of a table. The knife clattered to the floor. Walter grabbed the back of the biker's neck and drove his head down onto the tabletop with just enough force to make him go limp without killing him. The whole thing had taken less than 30 seconds. Walter stood alone in the middle of the diner, breathing slow and even, like he'd just finished tying his shoes. The 5 men who had entered like kings now laid scattered on the floor, groaning, coughing, stunned. They weren't unconscious. Walter had made sure of that. He hadn't lost control, hadn't let rage take over. Everything was calculated, clinical, a lesson, not a massacre. The waitress, still frozen behind the counter, blinked rapidly as though trying to process whether what she'd just seen had actually happened. "Are they?" she whispered. "They'll live," Walter said calmly. "I'll remember it better that way." Kane groaned, slowly rolling onto his back, blinking up at the ceiling like it had just betrayed him. Walter walked over, crouched beside him. "Let me give you some advice," he said, voice low but firm.
Ow.
"When you see a man minding his business, don't take that for weakness. Some of us are quiet for your safety, not ours." Kane stared at him with wide, stunned eyes, his breath coming in short gasps. Walter continued, "And next time you roll into a place thinking numbers make you strong, remember, you're only as strong as your smartest man. Don't see one among you." He stood and adjusted his jacket like he'd just finished a round of stretching. He took a slow look around the diner. Everyone else was still in shock, eyes wide, jaws slack. No one dared to speak. Finally, the skinny biker, the one who hadn't even thrown a punch, found his voice. "Woo, didn't know, man," he stammered. "We didn't know you were like trained or whatever." Walter turned to him and raised an eyebrow. "Would it have mattered?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "No," Walter said. "It wouldn't have. Because people like you don't pick fights you think are fair. No. You pick the ones you think you can win." The biker nodded slowly, shame heating his face. Walter took a deep breath. The old fire in his bones had stirred for the first time in years. It hadn't dulled with Ajit, had just been waiting. He walked back to his booth, picked up his cap from the table, and settled it back on his head. His coffee was cold now, but he didn't care. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a $20 bill, and placed it neatly beneath the untouched plate of eggs and toast. The waitress approached, voice shaky but sincere. I don't even know what to say." "You don't need to," Walter replied. "Do anything wrong?" She nodded, and then looked at the sprawled-out bikers. They're going to cause trouble, aren't they?" "No," Walter said flatly. "They're going to think twice, and that's more than most people ever do." Kane sat up slowly, clutching his ribs. He winced and looked at Walter, not with hate, but with something much closer to respect. There was confusion in his eyes, too, not just at the pain or the shock of being bested, but at the realization that his whole image of strength had just been shattered. "You used to be in the military?" he asked hoarsely. Walter looked down at him, his voice quiet but solid as steel. "I am military. That never leaves you." Kane nodded once. A slow, reluctant, hard-earned nod. Walter made his way to the door. Moving like a man still full of life, not weighed down by age but powered by purpose. As he reached for the handle, he paused and turned his head slightly. "Next time you walk into a place, think about how you want to leave it," he said without turning around. "That choice is always yours until someone else makes it for you." With that, he stepped into the sunlight. The door shut behind him, as the wind had picked up a bit now, carrying dust across the lot. His motorcycle, a simple black cruiser, sat parked at the edge of the gravel. No flashy paint, no skull logos, it's just steel and rubber and history. Walter swung a leg over the seat, pulled on his gloves, and adjusted his helmet. His reflection in the chrome showed a face, not angry, not proud, but centered, focused, unbreered. As the engine rumbled to life, he glanced back once. Through the dusty diner window, he saw the biker still sitting or slumped against walls, nursing their wounds in their pride. They wouldn't forget him. He wasn't just a story to scare rookies. He was a reminder that there are still men in the world who don't need to raise their voices to be heard, who don't need a gang to stand tall, and who damn sure don't walk away from a fight if it means protecting what's right. And as he rolled down that lonely stretch of road once more, with the sun dipping low behind the hills, Walter Jones felt nothing but peace. The road was long, his journey longer, but one thing was certain: he was still not a man to mess with. To be concluded in part 3, closing parenthesis, the wind rolled over the hills as Walter Jones rode alone. The low hum of his motorcycle blending with the quiet rhythm of the desert, as the road stretched out endlessly ahead, 2 cracked lines of faded blacktop slicing. Through an ocean of dry earth and golden light, the air smelled of sand, fuel, and the distant scent of sagebrush. Behind him, Miller's grill faded into the heat haze, and with it, the memory of the 5 men who had mistaken him for an easy target. He didn't ride fast. He never did. Speed was for people trying to escape something. Walter wasn't running. It's not from the war. It's not from the years. Not from the silence that came after every battle. His grip on the handlebars was relaxed. His thoughts, not so much. He hadn't wanted trouble. He never did. But trouble had a way of sniffing out quiet men, testing them as if the world couldn't. Believe in strength that didn't announce itself. He'd seen it his whole life on the streets of Alabama when he was a boy, in the jungles of Vietnam when he was barely a man, and now here, decades later, in a diner full of witnesses and cowards, it always came down to the same thing: people judging what they didn't understand. A lone, black veteran, old, quiet, traveling light, they saw a target. What they got instead was a living memory of warfare, survival, and raw, uncompromising, disciplined. The echo of Kane's voice still floated in his ears, confused, broken, laced with that bitter realization that pride had written a check Payne had just cashed. Walter's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses. A mile down the road, he saw a familiar sight in the rearview mirror. Dust, kicked up fast. A storm behind him. He sighed. They weren't done. He pulled off the road calmly, guided his bike onto a patch of gravel beside an old rest stop abandoned long ago. A wooden sign hung at an angle, squeaking in the breeze. Paint peeled off it like dead skin. Walter parked, his motorcycle beneath the shade of a leaning roof, and waited. 2 motorcycles crested the hill, coming fast, Kane and the bald one. Only 2. Walter stood with his hands behind his back, feet shouldered width apart, still silent, watching the bikes. Stop 10 feet away. Dust rose around them like smoke. Kane took off his helmet, revealing a face still bruised and marked with dried blood. His lip was swollen. His left eye showed signs of purple blooming. The bald one stayed on his bike, but looked uncomfortable, nervous even. Walter waited. Kane approached slowly. No swagger now, no smirk. His hands were open and empty. "I didn't come to fight," Kane said after a moment. Walter said nothing. "I didn't come to apologize either." "Not like that." He looked away as if searching for words in the empty landscape. I had to know." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Who are you?" Kane asked. Walter looked at him for a long time before answering. "Someone who's survived things men like you can't imagine." Kane nodded. "I believe that now." Walter tilted his head. "And why do you need to know who I am? You looking for revenge? Another shot at making yourself feel like something more than loud leather and bad choices?" "No," Kane said, his voice firm but low. "I'm looking for something real, something to make sense of what just happened back there. Because I've spent most of my life being the biggest guy in the room, the one people move for. And today, I hit the floor before I even knew I was falling." Walter nodded slowly, almost like a teacher who'd seen a student finally ask the right question. "And what did that teach you?" "That I've been pretending," Kane admitted. "All this time, the gang, shows of strength. It's just fear, covered in tattoos." The desert wind picked up for a moment, flapping. Kane's vest like a flag with no nation. "I was Army," Kane added, almost ashamed. "Got kicked out before I ever saw combat. Couldn't follow orders. Thought I knew better." Walter didn't respond immediately. Simply studied the man before him, bruised, humbled, Honest for once, you wanted to lead, Walter finally said, but you never learned to follow. Kane looked down. Yeah, Walter stepped closer, voice low. You judged me. Yes. You saw an old man and thought it meant weakness. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't care. You let your assumptions. Write this story. I did, Kane said. Walter's face remained stone. Then what makes you think you deserve answers now? Kane looked him in the eye. Because I'm not the same man I was this morning. Walter didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a small object, and tossed it to Kane. Kane caught it clumsily, a military challenge coin. Smooth and heavy, special forces, Kane read aloud, turning it over. Third group. Walter said, That's who I was. Kane blinked. That's the Green Berets. Walter nodded. I was deployed 5 times. Saw action in places most people can't find on a map. Did things I'll never forget. Lost? Friends whose names I say every morning? The weight of that silence pressed hard. Kane swallowed. But that's not what made me dangerous, Walter continued. It wasn't the uniform or the training. It was knowing when to act and when to walk away. You never learned that. I want to, Kane said softly. Walter studied him again, then change. Go back to your boys. Tell them what happened. Don't lie. Don't sugarcoat it. Make sure they remember. 'Cause next time the man they cross might not be as patient. As me, Kane nodded. And if you ever raise a hand to someone weaker again, remember every town has someone like me. Not loud, not looking for a fight, but ready. Kane looked away, his jaw tight. Understood. Walter stepped back toward his bike. The road can still teach you, but only if you're willing to listen. He kicked his motorcycle into gear again, the engine rumbling to life. Kane turned to go, then paused. Why'd you stop here? Why'd you wait? Walter swung his leg over the seat. Because men like you always come back, either to finish a fight or to start learning. And with that, Walter rode off once more. The desert swallowed him slowly, the fading sun casting long shadows across the road. Behind him, Kane stood still, staring down at the coin in his palm like it was the first piece of truth he'd ever held. Walter didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had left something more powerful than bruises behind. He had left a lesson, and for men like Kane, that was the beginning of change. Not guaranteed, not promised. But possible. Miles ahead, the horizon shimmered with heat and possibility. Walter rode into it, alone but never lonely, strong but never boastful, a soldier without a war, a warrior without an army, but with purpose burning, steady in his chest. The road would always try to test him, but the road didn't. Know who it was messing with.